Wednesday, June 20th, 2012. Hello everyone, my name is Sean Pittman. Welcome to Global Beat, the radio show of the students of the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition at McMaster University. Today we have a special episode concerning the Syrian Revolution and the events that have currently taken place. Despite international condemnation, the Syrian regime has continued to use lethal force against protesters and innocent civilians, including women and children. One of the most brutal assaults was in the city of Hula, where 108 people were killed. Homs, a common target from the regime, is said to be a ghost town in the making. More recently, the international media has voiced concerns over a potential massacre in Haifa. For more information on the current events in Syria, please visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/globalbeatcfmu and our Twitter at globalbeat_CFMU. Today we have Omar Alghabra, a Syrian-Canadian community activist residing in Mississauga, who will be interviewed by Kala Benghazi.
This week's hot topic.
Omar Alghabra is a Syrian-Canadian community activist residing in Mississauga. He completed his mechanical engineering degree at Ryerson University and received his MBA from York University. He's currently the president of AT Labs Canada. Omar's community involvement includes volunteering with various organizations such as Junior Achievements, which encourages youth to continue their education as well as becoming socially active. He has served on the Toronto Star Community Editorial Board and has authored various columns on both local and national issues. In 2006, Omar was elected as a Liberal Member of Parliament for the riding of Mississauga Erindale. Throughout his 2-year term, Omar championed issues pertaining to political accountability, immigration reform, human rights, and environmental sustainability. Omar has also served in a Liberal shadow cabinet as a citizen and migration critic, and later as a natural resource critic. We're delighted to have Omar here with us today to discuss the current events in Syria. Hello, Omar, and welcome to Global Beat Radio.
It's good to be with you.
I understand that you have family in Syria, including your parents. Are you able to get in contact with them, and how has the conflict affected them?
Yes, I am in constant communication with them over the phone or over the internet, and they live in Damascus.
Okay.
There's no doubt that ongoing situation in Syria has impacted their lives. Damascus tends to be one of the least affected part of the country, but it has been tense. There has been some violence. My sisters have kids that go to school, so school is out now. There were days when they took their kids to school where they could hear weapons being shot, and so the situation is terrifying. And obviously, they hear on a daily basis of stories that come back from other parts of the country about death and destruction. So. And I shouldn't forget to mention that the economic situation is quite stagnant. No investments is being made, and that there are constant checkpoints around the city. So there's no doubt that it has had a major impact psychologically, economically, and emotionally on their lives.
And why is it that Damascus has less of an uprising, I guess you can say, than other areas such as Homs?
Well, one of the reasons is that most of the elite or the, let's say, upper class that is benefiting from the existing economic and social structure lives in Damascus. But the other component is that that's where the regime has concentrated a lot of its security forces because they know they cannot afford to lose control over Damascus. Once you lose control over Damascus, I think it would be the immediate collapse of the regime. So it's the combination of the fact that there are more people that have a vested interest in the survival of the regime in Damascus, and the fact that the regime has put a lot of focus and emphasis on securing Damascus, makes it hard for anybody to organize protests. But believe me, having said all of that, from what I'm hearing, the amount of discontent and support for transition in Damascus is quite high.
Recently, there's been various news reports about massacres taking place in places such as Haifa and Homs, among other regions, of course. Can you please provide our listeners with some background information about what is currently taking place in Syria?
The biggest problem with what's happening in Syria is that it is very difficult to get information. Mm-hmm. The regime has denied journalist entry into Syria, so there's very little information, credible information that comes out. So what we hear on a daily basis, most journalists and media rely on reports from locals or social media. So we see occasionally images and videos and testimonials from people who are on the ground. So those are obviously, they unfortunately have not been confirmed by other media or by other sources, but there are stories of horror and death that are heart-wrenching. And we've been hearing there are a lot of parts in Syria that the regime has almost lost control of. Many villages, many towns where peasants and farmers and workers have stood up and protest and against the regime. And what's been happening is that the regime not only sends its military to surround the village, but also they apparently are deploying some of their hired thugs. They are known as in Syria as shabiha, which translates into thugs, who go into towns with their weapons, firing at people, beating up people, arresting people. And we've over the last couple of weeks we've heard of several horrific stories of death and massacres where villages have been massacred, many of them kids and women.
Now, other popular uprisings have taken place in the Middle East, so for instance in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and arguably Yemen as well. So why has the Syrian uprising, which began on March 15, 2011, taken so much longer than others? Is it because Assad still maintains popular support among his government and military personnel, or is it because of the lack of international intervention, I guess you can say?
Yeah, I think there are every country in the Arab world that has experienced an uprising has its own circumstances. So Libya's circumstances were different than Egypt and different than Yemen, different than Syria, different than Tunisia. But the one thing that is unique about Syria is the politicization of the military. Libya almost is comparable to Syria in the politicization of the military, but the military in Libya was not that strong, was not that coordinated, was not that equipped, and the population is quite dispersed. But in Syria, the military is very much an integral component of the regime. So in Egypt and in Tunisia, for example, the reason why the revolution appeared to be so successful so fast was because the military chose to stay out of refuse the orders of the president to get involved and quell the protesters. In Syria, the military and the paramilitary elements are very much an integral component of the regime. They're not even, like a hired element. No, they are an integral component. They're part and parcel of the regime. Therefore, they have a vested interest in seeing the regime survive, and they're willing, and they have proven so far that they're willing to use any kind of force to ensure the survival of the regime. So that's I think the major component. Now, yes, of course, there are elements within society that support the regime, but I don't think that is unique to Syria because in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Yemen and in Libya, there are some elements, maybe Libya less so, but there are elements in the population that were betting and benefiting from the survival of the regime. So I think, yes, I'm not denying that there are elements that support the regime in Syria, but I think it's more the security situation, the willingness to use force, and also the lack. You brought up that point, the confusion of the international community on how to react to Syria. Mm-hmm. There was very much a unanimous consent around the international community what to do with Libya, but there's confusion about what to do in Syria and how to react to what the Syrian regime is doing, and certainly that is caused mostly by the unrelenting support of Russia to and Iran and China to the Syrian regime.
You mentioned that the military is aligned with the Assad regime. So would you call the current conflict a civil war, or is it the people united against the regime?
I wouldn't call it a civil war yet. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that there's a huge risk that it is moving towards a civil war. And the reason why I could see this turning into a civil war is that the longer this conflict lasts, the more hate emerges and the more anger emerges. And the problem with this hate is that now it manifests itself into different forms. It's not just now, it will stop being a noble, peaceful protest calling for democracy and dignity, and it will start calling for vengeance and revenge and violence, mm-hmm. because people understandably are now very angry. Their family members have been killed, their neighbors have been arrested, tortured. And I think what ends up happening is the angry element wants to look for scapegoats. So not only will it direct its hate towards elements of the regime, but it will direct its hate towards anybody who it thinks is supporting the regime. And unfortunately, there is a sectarian flavor now that is emerging, and I hope it doesn't solidify. But there is a sentiment that the Alawites, who are elements of the regime, even though I don't agree with that, Alawites should not be guilty by association. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, it's emerging that way, and some people are also accusing other minority groups. And I think this will be the worst thing that ever could happen to Syria. And I hope that certainly the regime doesn't care if it turns that way, because it plays into their hands by calling it a civil war, and that there's a need for the military to enforce peace. But I worry about the division within Syrian society along sectarian lines, and I fear that it's moving in that direction.
Now, do you think military intervention is the only way to stop or prevent a civil war from occurring? Or what other kind of alternatives do you think would end the violence?
I'm one of those people who... First of all, let me say that this is a very difficult decision, obviously, and a very difficult call. See people suffer, and there's no doubt that we all in the rest of the world must feel and respond to a sense of moral obligation to do something about it. The only question is what, and I feel and I fear that a military response is not the ideal and best option. While some reactionary pundits have been calling for it, I do think it's short-sighted, and I think it may cause equally as much devastation, if not more, and inflame tension even more. So I know how it seems to some people that it might be quick and surgical. As someone who always believed that nonviolent means are a lot more effective, even though they're more difficult and may take more time. but I think they're much more effective and lasting. So I believe that it's clear to me now that the regime is not interested in reconciliation, is not interested in finding a peaceful way out. So then I would look towards the opposition or organized opposition leaders to work together to avoid first the slide into any form of sectarian rhetoric, to identify common ground between all voices, even the voices who are saying we wish the regime would reform, but if I have to choose between the regime and the opposition, I'll stand by the regime. I think some of these voices could be convinced to find a way to stop the conflict because they do care about civilian lives. I hope that opposition leaders find a way to identify common grounds, even if that common ground is not perfect, even if it doesn't provide them everything they're looking for, but if it does, if it stops the bloodshed, and if it starts a transition period, I think they all should reach some type of an understanding. And when you do that, when you find common grounds, and when you consolidate all of that support, including some sympathetic voices towards the regime that will eventually have to decide either go towards the brink or find an out now, I think they will isolate the Assad regime and eventually find a way out. So even though the onus should not be on the opposition, but I do think that given the situation and given what the regime has done, the opposition should try to find a way to consolidate support, to identify creative ways to increase more pressure. And the international community should play a role. I believe in sanctions. I believe in certainly diplomatic sanctions. I believe in isolating the regime from getting any weapons and any kind of, even frankly, financial benefits, and find a way to work with Russia, particularly Russia and China, to put pressure on the Syrian regime to end the violence.
Your alternative is a very interesting one, and I haven't heard that kind of alternative before, but another alternative that was proposed by the UN, Kofi Annan, was a peace plan, which a lot of people were critical of and said that it failed and were skeptical of from the get-go. What do you think of his attempt to resolve the issue peacefully?
I supported his attempt, and I supported the objectives. The 6 points that were identified in the plan were extremely useful and on the money. I believe today that the plan has failed, and I think that the international community should revisit the mechanics of how to implement that peace plan, but it should first start by saying that what we've done so far to get to the objectives or to accomplish the objectives of that plan has failed. The monitors have not been able to do anything. In fact, the violence has escalated. And I think they need to re-examine how to unfold or how to implement that plan. Having said that, I do support the goals of the plan, and I do support the methods of the plan, but the implementation so far has failed.
Now, looking more locally or locally in an international scale, do you think the Canadian government is responding efficiently to ending the conflict, or what more can the Canadian government do?
I mean, I think the Canadian government has been saying all the right things. It's clear that it's not a priority for them. The declarations they are making appear to have the right message. They were slow to terminate the diplomatic presence, the Syrian diplomatic presence here in Canada, but they just did that last week. And I think they need to work with the international community on adding more pressure on Russia and China. See, the bigger issue, the problem is that Canada's presence right now, diplomatic presence in the world or weight in the world, has been diminished, unfortunately, over the last few years. So Canada has lost a lot of the credibility that it used to have. So particularly, for example, with Russia and China and other international world leaders. So, but that's a whole different issue. I do think that Canada can do a little bit more. I do think that Canada can appear to can lead the charge, can appear to be more enthusiastic about finding a solution, but they're not. But having said that, they are saying the right things.
Yeah, it does appear that Canada is moving much slower to address the Syrian conflict as opposed to maybe addressing the Libyan conflict. What are your suggestions for concerned Canadians? What can they do to assist or put pressure on the Canadian government to take this issue more seriously?
So I have to start by saying that I have been really impressed by some of the effort that have been exhibited by many Canadians who are concerned about what's happening in Syria. And I've seen several flash mob videos and vigils and protests and fundraisers, and I've been impressed by that effort, and I support it. And I think it's really good to show that Canadians, whether they are of Syrian backgrounds or otherwise, do care and do want to make a difference. I do think that some of the weaker areas there has been the lobbying activities. So I think there should be more focused effort on reaching out to members of parliament, making compelling arguments and persuasive and logical and calm arguments to explain why Canada needs to take a bigger leadership role in resolving the situation in Syria. So I think there's room for improvement, but there's no doubt that I've been heartened by the effort and the activism of many Canadians that, frankly, in the past, I've spoken with about getting involved in politics and have shrugged their shoulders and said, "Why should I get involved? It makes no difference in my life." But now I'm watching them realize and come up with really creative, mature, and effective ways to express their frustration and to educate their fellow Canadians.
Thank you so much for coming on our show today, Omar. I hope your family stays safe and the violence ends very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I agree. I share your concern, and we all send our prayers and thoughts to everybody who is in this tough situation and hope for the best.
Today's segment was hosted by Kala Benghazi. Editing and post-production were done by Sean Pittman and Mullah Shahsavari. And a special thanks to our guest, Omar Alghabra, and all of our colleagues at the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition. Thanks for listening. That's our show for this week. Please remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/globalbeatcfmu and follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/globalbeat_CFMU. We'd also love to hear from you, and we are currently looking for volunteers. Please view our Facebook page for more information. Join us next week for part 2 of our focus on Syria.